The world had gone from a roar to a high-pitched, sizzling vacuum in less than 45 seconds. Staff Sergeant Hayes, Deacon to the men who survived his triage, crawled forward, his face pressed into the damp, humus-rich earth. T+0:30 seconds after the guns had ceased, the silence was thicker, heavier, and far more menacing than the preceding artillery barrage. The NVA had stopped firing, not because they were routed, but because they were counting. Deacon's M16 felt like a length of cold, useless pipe against the ringing emptiness in his temporal lobes. The immediate kill zone, a narrow jungle track bisecting a razorback ridge in the A Shau, was littered with wreckage, shredded packs, splinters of teak, and three figures who were now less men and more geometry, twisted angles of flesh and nylon that offered no hope of recovery. Deacon tasted bile and the fine grit kicked up by the B-40 rocket blast. His training, the rote mantra of the medic, screamed for movement, for action, but his experience demanded stillness. To move now was to confirm viability, to draw the immediate, precise attention of the snipers he knew were sighted in, watching the slightest shift of shadow or the twitch of a boot heel. He was pinned not by physical restraint, but by the psychological paralysis of perfect counter-ambush discipline. He inhaled slowly, counting the buzzing flies already finding the new scent, forcing his breath to mirror the pace of the wind rustling the elephant grass. 30 seconds ago, he was a grunt pushing patrol. Now, he was a target waiting to be confirmed. He reached out with his left hand, finding only the slick, warm stickiness that could only be blood, too much of it to belong to just one man. He had to know who survived, but the instant confirmation of life would likely mean the instant confirmation of death, delivered by a rifle barrel waiting for the twitch of fear or the call for help. The true war wasn't the noise. It was the suffocating calculus performed in the aftermath of the noise, where existence was measured in millimeters of movement and the control of biological necessity. He pressed his communicator button, a useless gesture, knowing the signal was either jammed or the set was shattered, but the motion was comforting, an anchor in the sudden, terrifying abyss of silence. T+1:15 after the ceasefire, Deacon shifted his weight, rotating his head just enough to catch a sliver of movement through the jungle gloom. He had three priority decisions, all demanding instantaneous execution, and all mutually exclusive. Priority 1, medevac the survivors. Priority 2, secure the perimeter against the inevitable follow-up assault. Priority 3, retrieve the M60 and its remaining chain of ammunition, the only realistic heavy fire asset they had left. He spotted Specialist Reardon, the patrol's radio man, flattened under the concave root of a giant fig tree, maybe 20 feet forward. Reardon was intact but frozen, staring straight ahead at something that Deacon couldn't yet see. The 1,000-yard stare distilled into 20 feet of immediate horror. Behind him, close enough to smell the burning nylon, was Sergeant Vance, the squad leader, half buried and moaning, a dangerous sound in this charged atmosphere. Deacon analyzed the risk. If he moved to Vance, he exposed his flank to the known sniper positions on the ridge. If he moved to Reardon, he risked losing Vance entirely to shock. The decision was tactical, not medical. Survival demanded firepower and communications, not immediate triage. He pointed his index finger, a tiny, almost invisible gesture in the dirt toward Riordan's position, holding the movement for 3 full seconds, then retracting it. This silent command was the key. Stay put, assess the situation, locate their flanks. Vance moaned again, a pathetic, wet noise that sounded impossibly loud. Deacon focused on the sound, realizing its strategic potential. The NBA would use that sound as a beacon, waiting for the relief attempt. He had to suppress the relief instinct. He whispered, a sound caught entirely within the damp collar of his own shirt. Vance, hold your breath. It was futile. Vance was too far gone. But the whisper was for Deacon himself, a reminder that the waiting game was still underway. The enemy was patient. They had the advantage of terrain and surprise. Deacon had the advantage of knowing exactly what they expected him to do: crawl toward the wounded. He refused the expected. Private Miles was the immediate critical security threat. T+2:30. Miles, the youngest member, the grenadier, had survived the initial blast, but was pinned by a fallen limb and a thick, gnarly root structure that had split the earth when the B-40 struck. He wasn't screaming. He was vibrating. His face, visible between two clumps of bamboo, was rigid with silent, paralyzing terror. He was conscious, looking directly at Deacon, eyes wide and begging. Miles reached out a hand, shaking violently, and the slight movement disturbed belief. It was a single, infinitesimal tremor, but in the amplified stillness of the aftermath, it felt like an earthquake. Deacon knew, with chilling certainty, that this single movement was enough to draw the attention of the NVA spotters. Miles had to be silenced, or saved, immediately. But extraction was impossible without making noise and exposing himself entirely. The moral dilemma of 30 seconds crystallized into one devastating choice: security or salvation. Deacon aimed his rifle, not at the enemy, but diagonally toward Miles's head. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, or even contemplated. He lowered the rifle slightly, focusing instead on a small, sharp piece of shrapnel lying near his hand. He flicked the shrapnel hard with his thumb, sending it skittering 3 feet away in the opposite direction of Miles. Wait, he needed to confirm the NVA reaction. The air remained still. They were disciplined. They were waiting for a larger target, a definitive move. Deacon crawled slowly, agonizingly, toward Miles, measuring the distance not in feet, but in years. When he finally reached him, he didn't pull him out. He jammed his filthy, earth-caked handkerchief into Miles's mouth, binding it with a spare length of parachute cord. Miles bucked silently beneath him, tears streaming down his face, the ultimate betrayal delivered by the man meant to save him. You breathe through your nose, Miles. You move, we both die. Deacon felt the immediate, deep resentment from the private, but the movement stopped. The perimeter was secured from internal collapse for now. The tactical picture began to clear at T+4:00. Reardon, still pressed flat against the fig root, used a broken piece of radio antennae to scratch marks into the wet dirt. He reported movement on the northern flank, a slow, methodical circling. This wasn't a disorganized follow-up. It was the textbook isolation and destruction phase. The NVA were not pressing the assault immediately because they didn't have to. They had the element of surprise and containment. Their strategy was now patience, waiting for the heat, the panic, the thirst, or the need for medical aid to force the surviving Americans into the open. Deacon felt a surge of cold recognition. This wasn't a hot engagement. It was a slow bleed orchestrated by someone highly trained. He signaled Reardon to retreat 5 feet, utilizing the cover of the root structure, and begin the silent, laborious task of clearing 3 fields of fire, narrow tunnels of visibility hacked through the density with a combat knife, not a machete. The key was concealment, not cover. Deacon observed the patterns of the enemy's patience. The jungle was alive with sound. Insects, birds, monkeys, but the human sound were absent. The enemy was ghosting. The true horror of the jungle war wasn't the sudden flash. It was the knowledge that you were being stalked by unseen entities that moved with the precision of ghosts. Deacon pulled a smoke grenade from his vest, holding it. The temptation to pop it, to call for immediate extraction, was overwhelming, but he resisted. Smoke was confirmation of location. It was also a beautiful distraction. He wedged the pin loosely, placing the grenade beneath the exposed corpse of Private Ortiz. Not the Ortiz who volunteered later, but the one who didn't make it, positioning it so that if they were forced to withdraw quickly, the motion of the body being jostled would pull the pin, offering a chaotic, momentary smoke screen. He was turning the fallen into tactical assets, a desperate measure that tasted like ash in his mouth. T+6:00. Deacon realized the silence was not a pause, but a calculated trap. The NVA commanders understood American military doctrine. never leave a man behind. They anticipated the surviving medic would attempt triage or retrieval of equipment. Deacon used this expectation against them. He began, slowly, to reinforce the hasty perimeter by utilizing the heavy, cumbersome equipment from the deceased men. He dragged packs, heavy with rations and spare ammo, into a defensive arc. He used a dead man's helmet, placed carefully on a bent stalk of bamboo, to draw the eye away from his actual position. The psychological warfare was as fierce as the preceding rocket fire. Every time he moved a pack, he expected the crack of a rifle, but nothing came. The weight was designed to break their nerve, to force a mistake. Deacon pressed his advantage in the stillness. He needed the M60. It was lying approximately 15 feet away, near the shredded remains of the platoon sergeant. He signaled Private Ortiz, the surviving one, the runner, via silent hand movements, a difficult, complex chain of gestures utilizing wrist rotations and fingertip taps to ready himself for a sprint. The objective wasn't just the machine gun, but the critical ammo belt draped near it. Ortiz nodded, his eyes wide and vacant. This sprint would define the next hour of their survival. It was 10 seconds of absolute exposure, 10 seconds where the entire weight of the enemy's patience would be focused on a single, moving target. Deacon prepared a burst of suppressing fire, his M16 loaded with tracer rounds, ready to fire not at the enemy, whose positions were still vague, but into the general direction of the ridge, solely to draw fire and give Ortiz those critical few milliseconds of distraction. This was the moment of transition, from absolute stillness to controlled, violent eruption. The dash for the M60 occurred at T+9:00, a terrifying, hyperspeed ballet of survival. Ortiz launched himself, low and fast, across the blood-soaked earth, every muscle straining against the heavy, humid air. Deacon opened fire, a short, furious burst aimed harmlessly into the dense canopy above the ridgeline, a calculated sacrifice of position for noise. The tracers ripped through the leaves, showering bark and debris. Immediately, the NVA responded, not with the focused sniper fire Deacon expected, but with 3 synchronized bursts from an RPD light machine gun, sweeping the ground where Ortiz had just been. This revealed their approximate position, high and left. Ortiz, fueled by adrenaline, reached the M60. He didn't just grab the weapon. He snatched the dangling 50-round belt of ammo, tucking the heavy, greasy metal links into his shirt, and reversed course immediately, ignoring the weight of the massive gun itself. Deacon maintained his suppressive fire until Ortiz was back under the minimal cover of the root structure. The combat had been reduced to a 10-second dash, and the prize was survival. Now, they had heavy firepower. The NVA, having revealed their location, fell silent again. They knew the Americans now had the means to retaliate, but they also knew they had trapped their quarry. Deacon checked the ammo belt. 52 rounds remaining, enough for 3 decisive, short bursts. He ordered Reardon to load the M60 and wait. The machine gun was their only deterrent against a human wave assault. The immediate, chaotic violence of the dash transitioned back into the suffocating waiting game. But now the stakes were higher, balanced precariously on those 52 rounds of heavy ammunition. T+12:00. With the M60 secured, Deacon finally risked movement towards Sergeant Vance, who was still moaning weakly, his breath shallow and wet. Vance was pinned by a log, his lower abdomen clearly shredded by shrapnel. Deacon crawled next to him, ignoring the metallic stench of pooling blood. Medically, Vance was lost. The internal damage was catastrophic, but Deacon was operating tactically now. He pressed his face close to Vance's ear, whispering urgently, "Vance, the fire. Where did the B-40 come from? Give me a position." Vance's eyes fluttered open, registering Deacon through a haze of shock. He coughed, spitting a mixture of blood and dirt. He struggled for breath, using his remaining strength to lift a shaking hand. He pointed not toward the obvious RPD position high and left, but further up, almost directly above them, into an impossibly thick section of triple canopy that overlooked the entire track. Observation, bunker, 2 men, control. Vance wheezed, the words dissolving into a gurgling sound. They saw us coming. All of it. This information changed everything. The ambush wasn't opportunistic. It was a planned engagement controlled by spotters who had let them walk right into the kill zone. The RPD was simply the hammer. The observers were the eye. Deacon understood the situation instantly. The NVA were waiting for them to move laterally to escape the RPD, which would expose them to the spotters. They were completely surrounded and observed. Vance had provided the ultimate intelligence, and Deacon offered the ultimate sacrifice. He pulled a syringe of morphine from his kit, administering a fatal dose, easing the sergeant's passage before the NVA decided to use Vance as bait. "We hold the line, Sarge," Deacon whispered, watching the light fade from the sergeant's eyes. "We hold it for 30 more seconds, and then we go home." The decision for withdrawal was made at T+15:00. They could not carry Vance, and Miles, due to the pinning injury and his psychological collapse, would slow them fatally. Deacon made the agonizing, cold-blooded tactical calculation. They had to leave the wounded and the dead to buy time for the living. He instructed Reardon to prepare the M60 for a mad minute, a sustained burst designed to distract the NVA long enough for the retreat. The goal was to break contact, not engage the entrenched spotters. Deacon focused on delay. He rigged every remaining piece of ordnance into a series of timed, booby-trapped delays along their proposed path of retreat. 2 fragmentation grenades, pins loosened and secured by tripwire attached to a vine. 3 claymore mines, rigged to fire laterally, not toward the enemy, but across the main path they had just abandoned, designed to catch the NVA flanking team as they pressed forward. He set a delay fuse on the remaining smoke grenade and taped it to Miles's chest. "Miles, I'm sorry," Deacon whispered, checking the fuse. "In 20 minutes, this pops. It buys us the time we need." The use of smoke would confuse the observation bunker, forcing them to guess the direction of retreat. It was cruel, but necessary. The immediate, silent pressure of the trap forced Deacon into actions that defied every principle of his training. He was turning his resources, the dead, the wounded, and the equipment, into expendable obstacles. The withdrawal path was set to move directly downhill, perpendicular to the main ridge, towards the nearest, densest bamboo thicket, the least obvious escape route. T+20:00. The extraction was no longer a retreat, it was ghosting. Deacon led Reardon and Ortiz, moving with specialized LRRP silence through the dense undergrowth. They moved heel to toe, their movements synchronized, utilizing the constant natural noise of the jungle. The dripping water, the cicadas, the rustling leaves, to mask their passage. Every few yards, Deacon would stop, pressing his ear to the earth, try to discern the sounds of pursuit. The NBA were not chasing them immediately. This was the most terrifying realization. They were consolidating the perimeter, certain the Americans were trapped. The true enemy became the sound of their own panicked breathing and the unavoidable crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Deacon was hyper-aware of his position relative to the spotters Vance had revealed. They were slowly moving out of the spotters' immediate line of sight, but the NVA flanking teams would be adjusting their patrol routes now. He could hear the faint, distant sound of an NVA whistle, a controlled, short chirp, not a pursuit signal, but a command for coordination. They were being boxed in, not chased out. The withdrawal was tactical, focused on reaching the emergency extraction coordinates, LZ Cobra, within the next 10 minutes, a position deep in a swampy section only accessible by winch. Deacon realized the 30 seconds after the ambush had expanded into a 30-minute psychological ordeal, where survival hinged on maintaining silence, discipline, and the complete suppression of a human impulse to panic or mourn. Ortiz stumbled slightly, catching himself on a thick vine. Deacon stopped, placing a hand on Ortiz's shoulder, using the pressure to communicate. "Control your weight, or we die here." T+30:00. Exactly 30 minutes since the initial fusillade had died away. The two surviving men reached the muddy, restricted clearing designated LZ Cobra. The air was heavy with the smell of stagnant water and decay. Reardon was furiously trying to repair the communicator, bypassing the main circuits and splicing a desperate connection into the hand-crank generator. Deacon heard the distant, muffled sound of the claymores detonating, a dull, tearing thump-thump that signified the NVA were pressing the attack on the kill zone, confirming the timing of their escape had been perfect. The faint whistle calls were closer now, the pursuit realizing the Americans were gone. Deacon felt a sliver of relief, immediately replaced by the hollow fear of the uncommunicated extraction. Reardon finally managed to raise a faint squawk of static. Ghost 1 to Cobra, do you read? Repeat. Ghost 1 to Cobra. We are hot and surrounded. Need extraction now. The reply was a garbled mess, full of static and delay. Then, a single clear word, Roger. Deacon slumped against a tree, the tension bleeding out of him in a rush of sweat and exhaustion. He looked up, peering through the dense canopy. He could hear the distinct thwop 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 of a distant Huey still miles away, but coming. The sound was salvation, but the NVA whistles were closer, sharper. Deacon hefted the M16, aiming it toward the jungle edge. The 30 minutes of waiting were over. Now, the final fight for the chopper pad was about to begin, balancing the promise of rescue against the immediate, rushing threat that had finally caught their scent.